Monday, I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're here to launch a report, a collective action agenda for women's economic empowerment, building ecosystems to empower women entrepreneurs and women in factories. It was authored by my former colleague Helen Moser, and also our contributing author is Erin Nealer, and they did a really excellent job on this project, and I encourage you all to read it. I think it's going to be an important contribution to the conversation about how we scale women's economic empowerment projects and work, and because I think this is going to be a very salient topic over the next several years, and I think you'll understand why as we go through this conversation. We've got a very interesting panel, but before I do that, I want to thank our friends at Walmart who helped sponsor the work that we did, and so thank you all for being here. And they have you guys have a summit tomorrow on women's economic empowerment. I hope you'll just spend a minute sharing with us when that is and talk about that, because I think we see this as maybe perhaps in a warm up to your summit, which is tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we've got four very thoughtful speakers. Kathleen McLaughlin, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and the President of Walmart Philanthropies, Walmart Foundation. They have Henriette Kolb, who is with IFC and is the head of the Gender Secretariat. And then we have Susan Beverly, who's with Abbott Labs, come in from Chicago to be with us. Thank you for being with us. And then we have Ambassador Milan Revere, who's at Georgetown University. Thank you for being with us, Ambassador. So I wanted to have each of the speakers talk about how they came to this conversation about women's economic empowerment, because there's very good reasons why we wanted each of the panelists to be on this panel to talk about the report, to help us to generate a conversation with you and also with the large audience that's watching this, is going to be watching this online and is going to be watching this going forward. So Kathleen, can I ask you we were having a conversation at lunch about how did Walmart get interested in the issue of women's economic empowerment?
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here for this conversation. Our effort with women's empowerment, I think you can trace it back, I was saying earlier, to Hurricane Katrina, actually, which was a moment where Walmart sort of inadvertently found itself as a first responder in the middle of this, one of the worst storms we've ever had in North America, because we have thousands of stores in the Gulf region, millions of associates, tens of millions of customers all through that region. And in the days of the storm and the aftermath, our folks kind of sprang into action and were providing food, water, shelter, life-saving measures to people all across that region. And during those days, they were calling back up to head office and asking the chief merchant at the time and the head of operations and the CEO for permission. Can we use this DC as a shelter? Can we provide this food to these people? And the answer, yes, of course, yes. And they were trying to help out from the center. Until at one point, the CEO just said, look, you know what, don't call anymore, don't ask us for permission, just do what you need to do. We'll provide whatever help we can, we'll figure it all out later. So you have carte blanche to do whatever you need to do. And in the weeks after that event, it caused a lot of reflection among the leadership team about how capabilities that we had just thought of as ways to serve our customers day to day could be relevant to achieve other outcomes. And the company was doing a lot of reflection in any case across a range of issues, from healthcare to sustainability to investing in associates. And it really culminated a couple months later in Lee Scott giving a speech that he called 21st Century Leadership, where he set out some very broad goals for the next 10 years, and you have to think this is back in 2005, some broad goals in a bunch of arenas where he said, look, as a leading company, we have strengths that we can use to help others. And we can do that in ways that also strengthen our business, which really set Walmart out on what we call a shared value sort of journey. This idea that it's not philanthropy, although we do have philanthropy, and it's not CSR, but it's about initiatives that we're undertaking to strengthen our business that are also helpful to communities and vice versa. And so, investing in women was one of those. And for a while, the company's focus was primarily internal. And over that period, we steadily increased the percentage of women in leadership positions, the percentage of people we were recruiting who were women, and so on, to the point where today 30% of our officers, our corporate officers, are women. which is twice the Fortune 500 average and much higher than the retail average of about 18%. So it's something we've been investing in for a long time. In 2011, we said, well, what about beyond our four walls? We have many, many women in supply chains around the world, and one of our biggest assets, if you want to think about shared value, is our purchase order. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year through purchase orders. And if you thought of that money as development capital, what could that create? Both in terms of buying from women entrepreneurs, but also elevating women in supply chains as far back as farms or factories all around the world. So we set out an initiative in 2011 with a few different goals. So one was to source $20 billion worth of product over a 5-year period from women entrepreneurs in the US, and to double our sourcing from women entrepreneurs in other markets. And then we said we would train 1 million women in supply chains. So 500,000 women farmers, 100,000 women in factories, women in emerging markets looking for their first job in organized retail or adjacent sectors. And then we also said we would encourage our major suppliers, so professional service firms and large suppliers, to put more diversity into their key account teams. So we also launched an initiative simply to ask and measure the diverse makeup of key account teams serving Walmart. So that's what we set out in 2011. And our goal was, from a business point of view, to do a few things. One, we had a hypothesis that our customers would value products from women entrepreneurs, that women entrepreneurs, like many entrepreneurs, would have more hustle and perhaps a unique consumer insight that would drive innovation. So we hoped it would fuel sales and margin and so on. And we hoped that investing in women throughout the supply chain would enhance the resilience of those supply chains, so mitigate risk, having women in more positions of control and agency. So risk mitigation, supply security, and also, again, customer trust. Our customers care about where the products come from. How did they get made? What happened to the people who made them? So we had business reasons, and then our social community goals were about empowering women. You know, most of our customers are women, most of our associates are women, so really helping women achieve the economic parity that we deserve. So that's why we did it.
Thank you, thank you. So Henriette, so you're with IFC, and you're the largest development finance institution. There's many other, the ones at the national level, whether the UK has one, the Dutch have one, the French have one, US has one, OPIC currently. Yeah. So why does this, why does the issue of women's economic empowerment, how's that cross IFC's radar screen? I can take a guess, but I would like to hear what your view is on that.
Thank you so much, Dan. And first up, congratulations to your team and to yourselves for actually flagging this, I think, very practical report. And I think that's what we're here to talk about, is really concrete steps that everyone can take to close gaps between men and women. And I think you just mentioned it, and it's the same reason for IFC. We are in this because it, A, makes business sense, and I'll come to a couple of concrete examples, but also, of course, it's very aligned to our development mission at the World Bank Group, which is obviously reduced absolute poverty and shared prosperity. So for us, it's almost, if you wish, a no-brainer, but necessarily it isn't as much of a no-brainer for our clients. And our clients are a very diverse set of sectors and industry dotted across the world, in particular a lot in fragile markets. And so we need to argue with our CEOs and counterparts as to why do we actually place emphasis on this topic. And I need to give them concrete examples, what's in it for them to close gaps between men and women. But before I come to these concrete examples, I just wanted to, just quick show of hands, and I know we have people on the web stream who can't sort of flag their hands, but I liked about the report that you flagged the term collective agenda. So I want to see who is in the room. Who is here from a think tank or academia or any researcher? Be proud, don't hide, hands higher. Okay, exactly, so we need the research community, and then private sector representatives, anyone? Yeah, perfect, and then anyone, government officials or multilaterals? Right, so I think this room is actually a perfect mix to make sure that we don't come up against the situation that the World Economic Forum dangles over our heads when they say it could be 170 years until we reach gender parity. So hopefully, if we step out of this room in an hour and a half or whatever it may be, we take your collective action agenda very, very serious, and we prove the World Economic Forum wrong, which I think would be a big success. Now, just to highlight that your report is in very good company, because as some of you might have been aware, the UN High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment have just released their second report. And again, it looks at 7 drivers of economic inequalities between men and women, and it provides concrete solutions. And a couple of them are very in line with what your report has put together. One is to look at clearly supply chains, and I think, again, the power of the private sector. We've seen governments mandating sourcing from women-owned enterprises. Kenya is an example, Rwanda is moving that way, and we see others. So that's certainly one. Then, of course, we also see the informality link between informal and formal workers. That's something you're covering in this report, in particular around, obviously, economies and factories. And then, of course, the issue around care. So looking at care, both elderly and child care, that disproportionately still does fall to women. And so we've recently, actually, at IFC, launched a big initiative that's called Tackling Childcare. And a lot of companies, and including senior management, initially were like, Henrietta, why on earth should we now really focus on this issue? What is our added value in this topic? Well, and then I kind of said to them, well, look, in 10 countries already, it's mandatory for companies to provide private sector-led childcare on site. That's India, Brazil, Chile, Turkey, Jordan, Ecuador, and more countries are moving along that line. Why? Because they see care is related to competitiveness. So if women and men, because men want to be caregivers as much, are not able to make choices around care, we will be pretty much shortchanging economies, we will shortchange families, and we will shortchange the workplace. And just to highlight a couple of evidence, so that you're not thinking Henrietta's making this up here as she goes along. So just to give you a couple of stats, McKinsey quantifies the unpaid care work at 13% of GDP annually. In addition, the International Trade Union Congress says if you were to invest in the care economy, and they looked at 21 countries, if you were to invest in the care economy, you would create double as many jobs as if you only invest into construction. So really good arguments to redistribute some of the care between both companies, governments, and families. And then lastly, and I don't need to tell you that because you've had fantastic work here in this house done on early childhood and youth development, only 17% across the globe of kids can access pre-primary school care. And yet it's very strongly linked with later on productivity in the workforce, and it's linked with obviously opportunities around learning. So it's a win-win case. Now IFC is very much obviously known for its capital, so I do speak about that for a second before I hand over to my colleague Suzanne. But so we invest around, or to date, around 19 billion. And I'm proud to say that out of those 19 billion, 1.4 billion have been invested only in women-owned enterprises. But of course, where do we go next? We know that capital is not enough for women entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that we close confidence, capacity, and capital gaps. And so with that, I want to give you just one hint on the business case that I'll come back to in the next round, which is our job as a development financing bank is to unearth additional market opportunities that are being left on the table and to make sure we are creating markets for all. And oftentimes we create markets, or the market creates markets for some. And so what we are doing is, for example, we looked at the insurance industry as an example that could make 1.7 trillion from women alone by 2030. Now, why is that? One, women are more risk aware, not risk averse. Women are spending more disproportionate amounts of their income on protection and mitigation. Women have higher protection gaps. Most of them obviously stay in the workforce for a shorter period of time if they're lucky enough to be in the formal sector. So of course, the pension outcomes in the end are also a lot disproportionately less. So if you look at the life cycle of women and girls, you see obviously the financial protection gap could actually lead to requirements around insurance. But believe it or not, very sophisticated companies around the world have never looked at behavioral segmentation that allows them to better understand what do women need and what do men need. And it doesn't necessarily mean different products, but it might mean bundling products, wraparound services, and different distribution channels. So as IFC, what we're helping companies to do is to spend money and to obviously invest in women and girls, but at the same time we provide advice to companies. How can you put together a customer value proposition that speaks to both, to men and to women, to rural and to urban, to all ages? So really to just embed that gender element in our conversations with clients. And I leave you with the one that's the most obvious business case, but I'm still staggered that it hasn't yet fully sunk in, which is obviously the link between senior management and women on boards and financial performance and outputs, yet we have numerous studies. I mean, we don't really need more data. I know we're always quick to say we need more sex disaggregated data, and yes, in some instances we absolutely do. And I really commend Walmart and other companies in this room for starting to collect sex disaggregated data. But on that leadership journey, we have enough. McKinsey, the IMF, Catalyst, Pew, I mean, you can just pile it on. So the business case is clear. So why we are still on the 21st century talking about could we get more data to prove that women are worth it is really quite mind-boggling. So I'm hoping that we can spend a bit of time also on that in our next round.
Okay. Susan, thanks for coming in from Chicago. You're the Senior Director of Sustainability at Abbott, so thanks for being with us. Tell us how Abbott sees these issues.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me and our company. We've been looking at women and girls historically since our inception. Women are core to our business, so we have data that shows that the majority, up to 80-90% of health decisions are made by women. And so I think we started out in the early days in more social programs and thinking about how do you help women along. And then we heard through our partners from women directly, bring us into your value chain, no more handouts, let us know how we can become part of your business. And so we started to fundamentally shift our business model, and it's from the core way of how we run our business to how we're working and emerging in new markets. And to that point, Abbott, and about 4 years ago, we spun off our proprietary pharmaceutical business. So we have nutritionals, devices, you name it, across the board in health. And we have to start to compete in different markets. So it's no longer about Western Europe and primarily the US. We're looking at Africa and India, Brazil, other Latin American markets, and that the competitive model, as all of you know here, is quite different. And for us, it centers around women. And so every conversation we have around a new product, a new service, a new opportunity, it's all about how do you bring women in, how do we engage women. And so our company, we started to go towards some of the obvious ways of delivery. We looked at local sourcing, and now we're starting to push ourselves and think a bit more innovatively as well at how else can you bring women in, how else can you engage. And so we see that in terms of our programming. I think internally, we're working towards great metrics. I think Walmart, your metrics are fantastic and quite impressive, and we're pushing our organization along the way. I think STEM has become a big area for our group, and we just launched a Women in STEM initiative and thinking about internally how do you build that pipeline, but then when you look externally, how do you start to identify areas in STEM that will really bring women along? So it's no longer just about empowering, but how are you investing in preparing women to come into value chains, to be competitive in the markets of the future. So that's really where we started and where we're headed.
Thank you. Ambassador Revere, thanks for being with us. You were the first U.S. Ambassador for Global Women's Issues at the State Department, but you also recently wrote a book called Fast Forward. I think everyone should go out and buy it retail.
Please.
It's on how women can achieve power and purpose. So you've been working on these issues for a long time. Could you talk a little bit about the business case for this? I think several of your colleagues on this panel have already made that, but I'd welcome your thoughts about that. And then also, could you tell me why has this been so hard to be adapted? What's holding this back?
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for everyone who's come today. I particularly want to thank Walmart because Walmart has been leading the way in many ways in this space, and particularly in ensuring that the CSIS study that you, I think, will all get.
Yeah, you all got. They all have it.
Took place, and what it does is it moves the kind of activity that's been going on, whether on the part of multilateral organizations like the IFC, on the part of businesses, or on the part of government, the stakeholders and NGOs, although we don't have their representation here. But what can we do from these learnings to actually advance the agenda? And just so you know, if you don't, that Walmart has had one of the biggest investments, if not the largest, in a women's economic empowerment initiative that has gone both to how they use their supply chain, to multiply dramatically the sourcing that they do from women-owned businesses, both domestically and overseas, as well as ensuring the training that needs to go on for purposes of retail in agriculture and in factories. And what they are saying to us today, by virtue of our coming together, is we have gleaned a lot from this experience. Many of the learnings have been tremendously challenging. This is hard to do. And as they are getting close to having achieved the goal that they set, this very significant goal, they are willing to share those learnings with all of us. So I think in a way, we have a new tool that's being created. And to me, the challenge that goes forward is how do we take this tool and ensure greater collective action? So this is something that was apparent to me when we first got into this space in a very significant way, ramping on work that had previously been done, but there had been dramatic changes, and the changes in many ways came out of the research field because increasingly we knew certainly that this was the right thing to do, gender equality, smart economics, but what we were knowing more in spades was that this was the strategic, smart way to grow economies, to create jobs, to ensure inclusive prosperity. And in that process, it became clear that we should bring people together who were engaged in this space, and as this was accelerating. And I remember very, very, as though it were today, a meeting that took place with many of the actors in this space, primarily from the business community. And as we listened to what each was doing, for example, tech companies were investing in training to close the gender gap in mobile and in the internet. And other companies were investing in training to really develop business skills and ensure good business plans. And almost like a gestalt in that room at that meeting, it was clear we weren't spending enough time developing the obvious synergies between these programs. Now, we're not there yet, and that's one of the reasons that this study has been produced. But what was clear then is certainly even clearer today, that this is where we need to make an investment for, to scale dramatically, but also to create more effective outcomes. Another investment was related, using multilateral platforms that the United States was engaged in to further this agenda. So for the first time ever, in 2011, women in the economy became a critical part of the APEC agenda. 21 economies, the Asia Pacific region. And the commitment was, that came out of the recommendations and then the leadership commitment on the part of the government leaders as well as the private sector leaders, was we have to address women's entrepreneurship. It is, particularly in SMEs, it is that missing middle. It's where we can grow economies significantly, but women face enormous barriers. You've heard some of the barriers, but certainly barriers to the credit they need, the capital, barriers to specific kinds of trainings and networks, barriers to markets, which is something that companies are addressing significantly through their supply chains. And today that has been enhanced, and large numbers of the participants within APEC have really accelerated that, and data and measurement to ensure its effectiveness is going forward. So you have an ongoing public-private set of commitments. Government also got engaged, again, more significantly, to catalyze public-private partnerships, where business could come together with NGOs, could come together with the government, realizing that we don't all share the same competencies. We certainly don't all have a monopoly on resources. And again, we needed to work together in ways that would help us accelerate the wins. And this was seen as a win-win-win. There are various ways to describe this, this shared value that comes out of these kinds of comings together. But while they sound easy and they sound good, they're not always easy to do. And the study that was produced explains some of what more has to be done in this space. So just to say that the place that we are today, I think says several big things to us from where we started. And that is that training is not enough. Training is important, but what kind of training? To what purpose? I have often been in a place where I've been told training programs were taking place, they were concluded, and I would ask, well, what's come out of those training programs? And often the answer is not one any of us wants to hear, because there really wasn't a whole lot that did come out of some of them. Whereas going back to what's been happening on the part of some of the companies, there's been detailed measurement of the outcomes of that training, and a recognition that training has to be a much more part of a holistic approach. So training without connectivity to supply chains for entrepreneurs doesn't get them very far. Training without connection to the capital that they need to grow their businesses doesn't get them very far. So I think, again, we have learned through this very difficult process that we have to make the investments that we do make in ways that have greater payoffs. And in the process of learning, for example, that training needs to be coupled with also access to finance, very innovative programs have been developed by the very companies who recognize this, whether it's what Goldman Sachs did or what Coca-Cola did, that we need to make available to these entrepreneurs with enormous potential, and often with the purchase order from companies, the ability for them to get the kind of capital they need to go forward. So in all of this space, and the study is very detailed, it's very good, it has recommendations, conclusions, it was based on interviews with an awful lot of the actors in this space. I think it gives us a new roadmap in many ways, a roadmap to go forward. And if I could just cite one example, because factories are also a part of the study. And we know that factories, particularly in some places like Bangladesh, have had serious issues with safety. And it took a lot of reputational challenge, it took bad headlines, but companies came together and created two major associations, if you will. The Accord, largely European, the Alliance, largely US. But it proved that when companies can come together and learn from their experiences, they can really address the problem. Now, a lot of companies in these very places are involved in skills training to help women, often for the first time in their lives, moving from the informal to the formal economy. They need every kind of skill, from hygiene learnings to leadership. And many of the companies are doing this, but what we're realizing is there's got to be a greater investment on the part of the factory owners, on the part of the companies themselves in the ways that they are measuring the outcomes of this, but even more importantly, how does it continue to become sustainable? Why should it be sustainable? What is coming out of all of this? But with growing recognition, it is important. So how do we go forward? And can we produce something the way the Alliance and the Accord have demonstrated that coming together can lead to positive conclusions? So speaking of conclusions, I'll just conclude and say that this kind of coming together in an integrated approach to ensure that the investments are made have the highest return, both for society and for business, the bottom line, I don't think can really get us to the next place unless we find more creative ways to do what the study says. We need collective action, and the question is, how do we get there?
That's it. Good. I'm going to come back to that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. So, Kathleen, let me come back to you. first, just so everyone knows, so tomorrow's the summit, and I want to just take a moment on that. It's at the museum.
Yes.
It's at 9 o'clock. So if someone here wanted to go, could they attend?
Yeah, please see me afterward if you'd like to come. We'll give you the logistics details, but yeah, we're excited about it.
Well, I want you to tell us a little bit. You've told us a little about your journey and sort of how you came to this place in 2011 to make this big commitment. So tell us a little bit about what the commitments were and what has been some of the outcomes of that, because you're about to be able to speak about that in a more explicit way soon. So.
Yeah, and that's really the focus of tomorrow. What we're doing tomorrow is announcing where we stand on the commitments. We've achieved most of them, and some are still in progress. And then we're bringing together thought leaders from other companies, from academia, from government agencies, other folks like Henriette from IFC, and many of the folks we've worked with as grantees through our programs, to discuss what have we learned, not just from Walmart's initiatives, but from everyone's initiatives. One of the most exciting things over the last few years as we've been working on this program is to see so many others entering and doing their own work. And we're now at a point where we'd like to say, okay, what have we each learned from things we've been doing individually, and how do we come together and work in a collective way to accelerate outcomes even further? So that'll really be the focus of tomorrow. We'll start with a plenary session in the morning, and then have a series of roundtable discussions in each of the aspects of our programs, internal and external at Walmart. So sourcing from women-owned businesses, women in agriculture, women in factories, advancing women into executive positions in retail and consumer industries, women in STEM, and so on. Things all related to advancing women in our sector and supply chains. So to your question, a couple key commitments. One was around sourcing $20 billion worth of product from women-owned businesses in the US. And the counterpart was to double sourcing from women-owned businesses in international markets. And that's been just outstanding. So we achieved the $20 billion mark a couple months ago, which we were really excited to do. Let me talk about that one a little bit, and then I'll talk about the international markets. So the way we went about it is, first of all, we said, well, we need to even find who are the women-owned businesses, because we didn't know. So we looked at our existing supplier base and identified who the women-owned businesses were. We've been working closely over the last few years with a couple of organizations that have been really helpful in this whole exercise, WeBank and We Connect International, who have both stood up ways to identify and certify women-owned businesses and provide them assists. So that's been really important. So our first step in the US was to look at our supplier base and ask people to identify, either self-identify and show who their owners were and their CEOs, or come through the certification program just so we could start tracking. Then we needed to go out and find new women-owned businesses. And because we're a retailer, we're looking for people who have products that are really relevant and exciting for our customers. We had done some research that showed that our customers were interested in buying products from women-owned businesses. And particularly women customers thought, well, maybe they'll be more relevant for me. Maybe they'll be an insight or even a higher quality level. So that was very encouraging. And as we identified additional women-owned businesses, we spent time listening to what were their challenges. Why weren't they already suppliers to Walmart or other big retailers? What stood in the way? There are a few things. One, access to capital. So if you are making tortillas in Atlanta and you're selling them locally, and Walmart comes and says, great, well, we'll write you a purchase order. We have 5,000 stores, and we'd like you to start sending them next week. There's no way you can scale up that quickly overnight. So we had to find ways to help these women get access to the capital that they needed to expand. And so we rejuvenated a program that we had had in the past and kind of gone dormant called Supplier Alliance, which basically allows a small supplier to use Walmart's interest in purchasing as evidence for the bank that their money is backed up. So it gives them access to much more affordable loans, much more favorable terms. Another issue, just business knowledge, how to run a good business, how to serve a big supplier, how to participate in inventory management and flow, and what are the quality concerns, and how to do pricing, and all of these kinds of questions. So we created some training programs initially for women-owned businesses. And what we discovered is they were so successful, the women who participated in these actually had much better sales improvement than ones who didn't. that we've now made them available to all of our suppliers. So that's been one of the most interesting things in terms of impact. Many of the things we created initially for the women-owned businesses have proven to be helpful for any business and have really driven sales and margin and everything else. So those were some of the kinds of things we did to help these women on board with Walmart and grow their businesses. Internationally, very similar issues, but of course the market context is vastly different place to place. And we're in 28 different countries. So you look at a place like Japan, for example, where we trade under the name Seiyu. In Japan, the challenge for the society is just to get women to even go into business, period. So we literally could not find women-owned businesses to buy from. Well, how do we find them? Do we put an ad in the paper? What do we do? So we ended up launching a series of contests in Japan, very well publicized, well marketed, to get the word out that Walmart's interested in buying from women-owned businesses. And those contests generated a bunch of entries that we could then select from and have people supply us. A place like India, totally different situation. There you have many women who are entrepreneurial. A very similar situation actually, Central America, Latin America, tons of hustle, they have businesses, but they might be informal. So how do you get them more formalized? How do you get them to the point where we could buy from them? So lots of intensive training with those businesses to be able to source from them. And the paper makes some really good observations about broader ecosystem supports that are necessary there for access to capital, to help people enter the formal sector, to help people deal with things like audits and so on. The third goal was around training women in supply chain. So as I mentioned before, our goal was to train 1 million women. And we broke that down into different parts of supply chains. So women in agriculture, 500,000 women we set out to train. There, the focus was on helping women enjoy the same livelihoods that male farmers have access to in terms of access to inputs and farming techniques and so on. So we partnered with a number of development agencies that have had long-standing, very successful development programs, but have tended to focus on male farmers. So everybody from USAID, Gates Foundation, TechnoServe, Mercy Corps, One Acre Fund, folks like that. And the programs varied substantially. So in some cases, we were working with adding entirely new countries and crops where women were the predominant farmer. In other cases, it was going, for example, we worked with IFDC in Bangladesh. Their farmers were male rice farmers, but there were women on the farms, the spouses, of the male farmers, who we worked with to help grow their own crops that they could then use not only to feed their families, but have some source of income, even if it was very local, in local markets. So the focus of those programs was on helping women participate in the economic gains that could be had in the agricultural sector. The Women in Factories program, very different. There we worked with CARE to create an open access curriculum pretty much from scratch at that time. You have to remember this is 5-6 years ago. And the focus was on giving women in the factory setting agency, giving them voice. And our hypothesis was that from a business point of view, the factories would be better off, more retention, less turnover, more productivity. And from a social point of view, women being empowered in this way would be helpful not only to themselves personally and their professional opportunities, but their families and their communities. So that curriculum was focused on everything from family planning, hygiene, nutrition, communications. How do you dissent constructively with a male boss or with your husband at home? So very basic skills, and then we did an advanced version of the curriculum, more of a leadership level for a subset of the women. And that one we're just about to get the results from a study that Tufts has been conducting on that. We're hoping it's going to show productivity gains and better outcomes for the women. Because again, we're trying to drive shared value. We'd like to transition that program from being something that we're funding through philanthropy to something where there's a real business case for. So those are some examples. Those are all the goals that we've been working on. The doubling the sourcing from international markets, I can't announce tomorrow that we've achieved it all. We have in some places. So Mexico, for example, we've doubled. In other places like China, it's only last year that we were able to actually count the women-owned businesses. So it's going to take us longer to deliver on that one, but we'll continue the charge on that.
Thank you. So, Henriette, thank you for your comments earlier about there are plenty of studies and there's plenty of analysis for this. Could you talk about, I used to work at IFC, and in addition to lending capital, investment capital, you all provide advice, and you also have some really compelling research or information so it's not so much, maybe it's not so much information about making the business case for this, but there's got to be certain kinds of insights that you glean that cause either policymakers to stop and think twice, or there's certain kinds of technical assistance that you talk a little bit about how IFC enables either through its advice or through its research and sort of its engagement with policymakers, how you're making change happen.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, just to pick up for a minute, before I come back to the question on what you said in terms of setting the country context, right? I mean, you're in 28 markets. We are in over 160 countries around the world. And so clearly, we have very different lessons that we've learned from very different regions we work in. And so the constraints for women and men and the social norms and the cultural ecosystems obviously differ extremely. But I would say there are three things that we try and do with IFCs and that we've learned so far. One is walking the talk. We have no credibility with our government clients or with our private sector clients if we can't explain to them how IFC or the World Bank Group as a whole is actually applying diversity measures internally. So I'm very proud to share that we were the very first development financing institution to get certified as EDGE, which is Economic Dividends for Gender Equality. It's a methodology that triangulates internal data, both HR data, employee perception surveys, as well as policies. And it looks at, okay, where are you losing talent, male and female, and where are you gaining talent? And it benchmarks you against others. And the benchmarking part is the one that obviously is most successful because we're very competitive in spirit and collaborative. But that really made sort of I would say there was some level of inertia and kind of we've tried everything, we've tested everything, and we're done with this. What more can we do? We're not so bad. And then to actually say, look, here it is, here's the evidence from a third party, and to get audited on what we present in terms of data was extremely powerful. And the president, Jim Kim, has just announced 2 weeks ago that actually we are now aspiring to the next level of the certification, because there are three, and I'm not giving anything away publicly because it's been in the media that we only obtained the most basic one. And one reason for that is we have shareholders from across the world, and it's the prerogative of governors to appoint executive directors to our board. So we have no autonomy or authority to obviously dictate as to who should sit there. But in an ideal world, of course, at least 30% of our own board members should be diverse. And at the moment, we're not quite there. It goes through fluctuations, but we're hovering between 20 and 26%. And then if you count senior advisors and so on and so forth, it looks a little bit better. But so there's work to be done. So I would say that's number one, really to walk the talk, because otherwise why have a conversation with a client and actually charge the client for your advice if we haven't been able to give the advice internally, right? So that's number one. The second one, and that brings me to the point where we have instances where we work with clients where collective agenda works beautifully. And I'll give you an example. Papua New Guinea, violence against women, huge challenge. What we've done is we did an advisory project there, and we found that 11 days per worker were spent being absent from the workplace due to violence. So that was, if you combine that and you have 22,000 workers in instance, one company we work with, that's a massive amount of wage bill loss, to put it crudely, and productivity losses. And of course, it's terrible impact on families, women, and so on. So there what we've done is, instead of going from company to company and building something that's unique to the company, we actually created a coalition of 50 companies in Papua New Guinea, ranging from ExxonMobil to much smaller catering mining catering services, and said, look, you've got collective an issue. So what are we going to do about it? It's not good enough to just import from Australia a ready-made anti-sexual harassment policy and program. You need to tailor something that's best practice globally, but then really zoom in on the very specific circumstances that Papua New Guinea actually has. And so as a result of that work, we've put together a family sexual violence policy that is being applied by now employers. That is a policy and a program, and we are also setting up collectively a safe house. because the government provided services were not sufficient, in particular in some of the extremely remote islands, to actually tackle the problem and to provide not just prevention but also alleviation once things have happened. And so that also looked at transport in particular, and safe transport, where a lot of incidences occurred, so that women didn't feel safe to even come to work. So that's a very good example for where collective agenda works very well. No need for individual companies to do anything. If, however, you are, I'm making an example with one of our clients, BLC, a bank in Lebanon, and they want to better serve the women's market, they of course are not having any interest to share their own data with the rest of the financial institutions in Lebanon, because they want to have a first mover advantage. They want to make sure that they know their NPLs by men and by women, they know their different loan products, they know their customer time spent with men and women in the sales front. So that's an incidence where we will provide advice and capital, and we don't necessarily then go and shout it from the rooftops, because we have commercial sensitive data that obviously we protect as an institution. So in these instances, we can distill best practices, which is something IFC is doing, and we've just launched our very first e-learning course that all our investment officers and advisory staff can take, that has these very concrete examples, but it's internal because it has commercially sensitive return of investment data that we're not necessarily sharing. And then the last one point that I wanted to make is that often when we work with clients, to your point, it's a holistic package. So usually 3 ingredients: the business case, which is a research piece and impact valuation. Second one is the actual client advice. And then the third one is being part of a global partnership. And again, to share some of the learnings that are not commercially sensitive. And there we have several partnerships. One is the Global Banking Alliance for Women. Some of you in this room know it very well. It's an excellent industry-wide association that IFC and IDB and others and EBRD are very committed to, because it helps the industry to understand what value proposition women can bring. No, non-performing loans are not higher when you bank women, and no, women are not necessarily higher risk, and no, women are not more costly to bank, but instead women are more loyal, stay with the bank longer, are more able to cross-buy products and so on. So that's kind of the bit we do. I just wanted to maybe mention one more example, which I find quite fascinating, which is in the Solomon Islands, again, really difficult work environment around our factory work. So there we're investing in a tuna fishing company. And what they realized that actually just 2 weeks before pay time was due, hardly any workers were anymore in the company at the factory floor, and 70% of the workers are women. So we did a bit of digging. So we don't start off and saying to the CEO and so on, do you have a gender problem? We say, oh, so what's going well in your company? What are you struggling? What are your business challenges? And so we learned around this absenteeism. We were really sort of puzzled by that. So what we unearthed was that actually women, because of their many care responsibilities and income allocations, had run out of money before the paycheck came through, or had very little control over the money because husbands or others would take it. And so instead of showing up at the factory, they actually then, in the meantime, operated their private businesses and sold fish on the side, because they felt that they could make an additional amount of money before the next paycheck came through. So what we try to do is obviously do financial literacy education, and I think you mentioned it with your farmers training, and I know BSR has done some terrific work in Bangladesh on financial literacy training, but we've also helped educate the senior management to actually use digital payment services to actually make sure that women have more control over when they spend money and who spends money for what within the household. So digitizing wage payments of factory workers has a huge disproportionate benefit to women being able to control allocation of household income for a longer period of time. And after that intervention, actually the number of people who still had both men and women, to your point, often it's beneficial, right? We didn't just financially train women, but all workers, but we found that actually double the amount of workers had income in their pocket when the next payment period came through. So these are some of the examples of the concrete work we undertake. And actually, interestingly, what we found is capital alone is not as efficient as advice and investments for our clients. Not just for the women entrepreneurs, but the same goes for clients. If we look at the impact around and the sustainability around gender smart solutions, we've just done something really difficult, challenging territory with Bank of Palestine in Gaza and the West Bank. Again, we have an investment and an advisory component with them. And we've seen really terrific results. In fact, the CEO of Bank of Palestine has just launched a second cohort, and we've supported one of the first and only official women in Gaza. And if you just read up on her story, I think you're all blown away in terms of some of the challenges she had to overcome and how that combined service package between being able to get a loan as well as getting some non-financial service support has been helpful.
Thank you. Susan, how does women's economic empowerment, these issues, how does it make Abbott a stronger company? And how does Abbott think about this? Does Abbott see this as a philanthropy? Take this from an approach from a philanthropy? Does it approach it as corporate social responsibility? Does it see this as part of its core business? Please.
Yeah, we definitely approach it as core to our business. So our approach with women's empowerment, we tend to look at it around shared value, the term shared value. And you know, we started off, as I mentioned before, in a philanthropic route, and we learned that you know, obviously is not sustainable, but that's not how we were getting the best value out of women and really finding the best way for women to contribute to society and to contribute to our business. So one of our most interesting and newer programs is we decided to locally source dairy for our nutritional products in India. And I'll remember when we first started this program a couple of years ago, we went to our local supplier in India and we had a focus group with the smallholder farmers. So a group of men came and we asked a number of questions and we said, who does the majority of the farming? And they said, well, women do 75% of the farming. We said, okay, well, who does the rest? And so they said, oh, it's the women. And they were laughing, and it was such an interesting and pivotal moment for the program for us because we knew there was going to be a women component to the initiative, but we weren't sure exactly how big that would be. And from that moment, we had to fundamentally shift our business model in terms of how we were going to engage women in this local sourcing program. And then we started to dig and say, we can train women, we can give them access to information, but what are some of the other issues below that layer of the program? And so we asked ourselves the question, what else? And as I read the report, I said, there are all of those issues, but there's also that what else? And I think Ambassador Revere, you mentioned with the factory workers, training's not enough, and some of the issues that you even raised, I think we're starting to look at and companies should look at because there are other barriers that keep women from engaging, and companies can get so focused on, I want to locally source my milk, or I want to train women on technology, that you forget that there's so many there's an ecosystem within the ecosystem that you need to start to unpack, and I think that's where collective impact can really come in and play, because maybe Abbott's not best poised to address all of those issues, but we could partner with another organization to tackle some of the other social issues that are really keeping everyone from being successful. So completely fundamental to our business strategy, I mentioned before, is we're competing in new markets. It's always on the table. Women and children is a thread between, for all of our businesses, and figuring out how we bring them in to help maybe innovate products, not just around delivery. You know, what are ways that we can really invest in women to change the way that we do business, but to also transform economies.
Right. Ambassador Revere, one of the things that's come up in this conversation at lunch was the issue of how we enable collective action and scale. I think there's a role for the U.S. government in this, and so let me ask you to put your old State Department hat on, if you would. If you were thinking about what would be the things if you were sitting in government now or in the future, what would be the sorts of things you'd want to see happen to help bring about further scale? Would you be financing a series of new additional pilots? I suspect the answer to that is no. But you know, but I think what would be some of the things you'd want to do if you were sitting back in the U.S. government? Because I think sooner or later the issue of women's economic empowerment is going to rise to the top of the agenda in this new administration.
Well, I think that's a really good question, Dan, and I think probably many are wondering, is there any future in terms of government engagement in this space? And I would say that this has always been an issue that has brought us together as opposed to tearing us apart. It's been nonpartisan. Business has been an active partner in it. And I think there's a sense that it is a win-win because the kinds of social progress that government wants to see, even in terms of our own economy and the benefits of that as others prosper, as well as the bottom line for companies, all fits together. I would say for anybody who's involved in this space going forward in the new administration, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good work that's been done, and we should grow what has happened and scale it as opposed to not creating new pilots, but really learning from the kinds of experiences you've heard here that can take us to the next step. TPP may be down, or it may find a new way that it is reconfigured, but there's going to be a lot happening in trade. There has to be, because it's the way that our global economy works. Women have not heretofore benefited as much as they need to from trade, yet a number of the programs that have been put forward that have involved government have also involved the business community. The business community's been a strong partner in those. Those lessons need to be learned, and they need to grow for other places, whether it's in Africa with the African Growth Opportunity Act, whether it's in the Asia Pacific region, whether it's throughout Latin America, and the kind of work and investments that have gone on. I think another area is if government invests in ways that build on what's already happened, is in fragile states and conflicts coming out of conflict societies. And we had several people in an earlier discussion that has been alluded to who are doing very innovative work in very difficult situations. And many of them have entered into them not as philanthropic projects, but as business investments. And as we come off or come out of conflicts, hopefully, or try to stabilize the world in better ways, we are going to need to address economic opportunity. And we should not address it in a vacuum. We should learn from these experiences what works, how to target training, how to really build on what has taken us so far. And that's why I think this discussion is so important. Because no matter if you sit at Walmart, or you sit in a multilateral, or you sit at Abbott, or you sit in the US government, this is about something that we all believe has value. We look at it through a different lens in terms of the outcomes we want, but when we come together, we can better achieve those outcomes.
Thank you. I want to call on several people in the audience. The gentleman in the front row gets the award, I think, for flying the longest distance to be here. Sir, you're the CEO of Walmart India. I'm so pleased that you're here. I'm wondering if you might just reflect a little bit on the conversation that we're having. I'm going to have my friend is going to give you a microphone. But just if you could just reflect a little bit, how is this conversation relevant to where you are in India?
The conversation is relevant.
And just say your name. So
my name is Krish Iyer, and I work as President and CEO of Walmart India. The conversation is very relevant, except that the problems of a developed market and the problems of emerging market are so different, and the opportunities are different. So, for instance, when I look at if I had, for instance, $100 million, where would I put it? I would put it on women farmers, because that's where you get the maximum productivity gain in India, as an example. So I think Walmart in India has been very strategic in terms of focusing on certain areas as far as corporate social responsibility is concerned. And I think this point regarding this not being a philanthropy, but a creation of shared value, that is so relevant, because only then it becomes sustainable. So if it's profitable for the business, it will be sustainable. If it is not, I think during difficult times, it will all fall apart. So with that philosophy, we have created several programs, particularly focused on small women farmers, skill development for women internally in terms of taking up leadership roles, the Women Entrepreneurship Development Program as a pilot, which has been extremely successful and which is going to be now expanded further. And generally, I think advocating women's economic empowerment in every forum so that more companies really join the cause. That has been our approach.
Thank you very much. I want to ask Professor Drusilla Brown, you're at Tufts University, and we were having a conversation earlier about research and making the case, and you've been leading this important research work. I know you may not be able to share all of your findings now, but I just thought some of your comments at the lunch today were really insightful. I'd welcome your chance to just reflect a little bit on this conversation, but also sort of some of the research that you've been doing.
Yep. So I'm Drusilla Brown from Tufts University, and we've been using the strategy of randomized controlled trials to try to really nail down how these programs really work.
So Professor Brown, that's the Cadillac of research, right? That's not the Chevy. That's so if you're doing a randomized control trial, you're driving the Cadillac of the RCT is the most robust but also the most expensive way to do research. So you're really using some of the best analytics to look at this.
So like the Tesla.
The Tesla. It's the Tesla. It's the Tesla of research. That's it.
So essentially, what we've found a lot of really interesting things, but there are lots of things we still don't know. But what some I think are the big findings are that empowering women, in fact, does have a really strong productivity impact. It makes workers more likely to stay with the firm. It makes them more productive. It lowers the absentee rate, and there's also a lot of evidence that making workers just generally, not only making them feel more empowered, simply making them happier actually makes them more productive. There's a wonderful experiment where people are just shown a video of a comedy, and then they're given math problems, and lo and behold, they can do more math problems more accurately if they've just seen a little comedy than if they had not. So that simple interventions that make people feel better about themselves, and particularly making women feel better about themselves, giving them tools for interaction, actually have strong productivity consequences for the firm. And it helps unravel one of the really fundamental problems that firms often have is they're afraid to make investments in the skills of their workers because turnover is so high. So if you can bring the turnover rate problem down, it makes firms more willing to invest in the skills. But I think one of the really big findings from all the work that we've done is there's a lot of money being left on the table. That is that firms are throughout the world missing huge productivity opportunities or profitability opportunities because they don't treat their workers in a humane way. And so the simple humanity of a women's empowerment training or jokes of the workforce or a little pay raise, all of these things are empowering, and this has a huge effect on the organization of the firm. The second thing we found that I think is really big and important is that it's really important to do the empowerment piece at the same time you work on technology, because if you try to improve the technology of the firm, that is get them to use better production systems without also doing the empowerment side or the labor protection side, you actually make the outcome for the workers worse rather than better. So that it actually causes a lot of tension inside the organization when you try to change the production system, but there isn't a lot of inclusion going on with workers in the process. So I would say those are, I don't know if you wanted me to keep going.
No, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I'd love to hear my friend Dr. Golden in the back.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicole Golden. I'm a senior associate here at CSIS. I consult with the World Bank and adjunct faculty at George Washington. Thanks for this useful report and a great conversation. Don't disagree with anything that's been said, but would add on one of the barriers and the challenges we haven't heard as much about yet today are in the realm of property rights, land rights, inheritance rights, things that relate to opportunities and entrepreneurship in particular, as well as to a certain extent factory workers and other kind of wage workers. So I'm curious, in the collection action agenda, we haven't heard as much of your thoughts on governments at the country level and what their role is, and in particular, again, these barriers around rights.
Thank you. So, Ambassador Revere, I know you've got a conflict. I know you have to go. Do you want to just leave us with any parting thoughts?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and even though it hasn't been mentioned in the realm of the larger barriers that are confronted, not just in the developed world, as the case may be, but in the emerging markets, I think these cultural issues are huge issues. Land rights, inheritance rights, they have to be addressed if women are going to progress, particularly in agriculture. The lack of ability to have tenure land rights or ownership is a huge, huge impediment. And it's one of the fundamental investments that has to be made if we're really going to grow women's economic opportunity in ag-based societies. So that's critical. I think another critical issue is mindsets. We still have to, whether it's the top leaders in this country, as Henriette put out in her frustrated listing of how we're still up against that so-called ceiling, but we really have to get across with all the data that exists that this is really the place where investments that can be made. Now, surely there are challenges, but also it's a no-brainer in many ways. You can't write off half the population of the world and expect economies to grow. So in some societies, there are many more fundamental problems, but even in societies where we pride ourselves for the progress that's been made, we're still bumping up against it. But I think that this is one of the things that comes out of these kinds of learnings, to be able to move forward despite those kinds of challenges. But that is an absolutely fundamental point that you raised.
Thank you. Thanks. So Henriette, you had a reflection you wanted to make.
Just to add, I think, and just to flag for people who are sort of practitioners, Women Business in the Law does a terrific job in putting out a report every 2 years that sort of looks at across 180 economies how many discriminatory laws are still on the books. And if you take a peek into that, there's still a vast amount, at least 150 have at least one law that discriminates. So that's a large chunk of the world. And then 18 economies have actually more than 10 discriminatory laws. And what we also find in the role of government is, for example, where government mandates childcare, you have a much higher participation of women in the formal labor force. So there's tons of, obviously, sort of legal distinctions. Also, we're just working in Sri Lanka, and there you have on the books that women are not allowed to work part-time, and women are not allowed to work night shifts, and women are not allowed to, in Russia you have, I think it's probably around 40 industries that women are not allowed or supposed to go into legally. So there are restrictions that obviously companies have to work around, and if they can't do it on their own, then they have to build coalitions to actually tackle some of these more legal and challenging constraints in conversation with governments. Equally so, central banks and the Alliance for Financial Inclusion is doing terrific work around that to make sure that you collect sex disaggregated data from your financial institutions. So if the central bank asks these questions, and Canada has just put their budget out and looked at gender responsive budgeting, so there's tons and tons of work that governments can do. I just want to maybe make one observation in our conversation that hasn't yet come up, but yet it came up when I walked into the room, because I was unfortunately late for the lunch, but early for the event. So I had a little chat with our fantastic IT folks. And so one thing that we need to do is to make sure that we engage men and boys, and in particular politically around the world, to not portray this as a zero-sum game. Because what we found is that actually you have income inequality, which is linked to gender inequality, and the IMF has done a great working paper around that. So when we talk about embedding more women in the workforce, in the supply chain, in community leaders, whatever it may be, it cannot be at the detriment of others. And so making that argument and explaining that in some cases it will be zero-sum. I mean, there can only be one CEO, right, of a company in most cases. But at the same time, there are larger spillover effects demonstrated in the Better Work program and in your fantastic impact assessment that benefit all. And to be honest about these, because I think there's no point in kind of selling a story that doesn't really prove out to be true in reality. And so to my earlier point, just wanted to call out these gentlemen in the back. So Oliver and Brian, we had a bit of a chat, and you're part of a Year Up, right? Year Up program that's giving them the opportunity to do internships, and CSIS is so kind enough to obviously partner with you guys. So anyone in this room who is interested in giving people the opportunity, boys and girls or men and women, to actually do an internship. And then I think with you two, you're looking for ongoing employment in the IT sector. So if anyone needs bright male IT stars who are with us, I just wanted to give you guys a shout out, because I think we can only achieve that if we role model behavior across both genders. And you have been excellent role models, because I was all by myself here, and you struck up a conversation. You were extremely confident. You asked me questions, and I thought that was just fantastic. So if you were to do that with all your girl peers, I think the world would be a much better place.
Good. So, Susan and Kathleen, just this issue of government and partner governments. When you've worked in, so you talked about an example in India, and Kathleen, you have a number of different countries where Walmart is working. What's the relationship been with the local government? Talk a little bit about that.
I'm going to call on Sarah to give a couple examples. Sarah is a colleague from Walmart and leads our government relations function.
So I think for us, the sweet spot has been where you have a mutual alignment with governments, where they understand the value of full economic participation. So, one of the areas of inspiration from our program was actually our colleagues in Central America. When we were acquiring a number of companies in Central America, there was a concern that when Walmart came in, that they were only going to source from big companies. So they were actually the most innovative in coming out and thinking about how do we source from small businesses. So they worked with local governments, local associations to actually source small businesses, to help train them and have business rounds with these in each of the Central American countries to actually have focus groups and rounds, and then buying opportunities when they would bring these businesses in. And we use that model actually to say, can we do this for women as well? And partnering with those governments was particularly important, because then we could also partner with the IDB and do training programs for especially foods and crops, et cetera. So, finding ways where you can actually leverage government interest, a business interest. Some of the examples that came out, we had one tortilla supplier. That's not great for Walmart to have one tortilla supplier in Central America. We had one milk supplier. How are we creating competitive sourcing by doing this and by having more robust sourcing? In other areas, we've worked very collaboratively, multilaterally. So in APAC, we're financing a program called We APAC, working with the State Department to basically create a dashboard for women-owned businesses to say, what are all the resources out there for me? Because what we found was a lot of people were investing, but these women didn't know, how do I go and access these resources? Summit of the Americas, we've worked very collaboratively with governments to create, with Government of Chile, with NGOs to create opportunities to promote women-owned businesses with ProMujer and others. So what I would say is, one, what we have learned is it really takes leadership to create the enabling environment. I mean, Ambassador Van Veer sort of undersold the work she did to create and integrate gender as an issue in all of the areas that the Secretary of State went. So if you're going to go to APAC, what's the gender agenda? If you're going to a country as a Secretary of State, are you going to meet with the women-owned businesses? That created a tremendous on-road for us to sort of follow behind and capitalize on that. And I think that's a call to governments to create a mutually supportive environment, as opposed to, I think it's hard when we say you're doing it wrong, as opposed to leading by example and showing where we can collaborate and showing the benefits to businesses and society when we do it well. Because what we've seen is, as we've gotten these women into our supply chain, they lift a hand right back. They hire more women, they mentor women, I was at a meeting in Peru where a woman said, my business was failing until I saw her, and she was able to do it, and she told me how to do it. So tremendous opportunity, but really finding ways to have leadership. With your $1 billion, part of it is creating the incentive for governments and for multilateral institutions. You've got really strong leaderships in the institutions going out there and promoting this. So.
Thanks. Sarah's referring to, I asked at lunch, if you had $1 billion, what would you spend it on to scale women's economic empowerment? Because I think at some point, someone in the U.S. government is going to be asked that question. It won't happen perhaps in the next 2 months, but I think sometime in the next 2 years, there'll be a question that says, okay, well, how do we spend? There's going to be some kind of an ask and some kind of a deliverable, a government deliverable, and that's what I said at the beginning, that I think this is going to rise to the top of the agenda. And I think the question I asked at lunch is, okay, so if you had $1 billion, meaning if the U.S. government said they were going to put $1 billion into this to scale it, what would you spend it on? So that was part of the conversation we had at lunch. But Susan, I want to come back to you. So Dr. Golden asked about what's the role of local governments. How does that come across your radar screen at Abbott?
It's right there. So when we started our dairy initiative, for example, we went and talked to the government. In India, as many of you will know, there's a formal dairy sector that the government has created. And to be a part of that movement led us to some of the most striking and impactful conversations with government. And so I agree with the point that you need to find aligned goals, and that really is going to move things forward. An additional point that I'll add that I think about is, yes, incentives for government, but I also like to see civil society push government, and then also government pushes business. I mean, in the investment community as well. And I'm not exactly sure, and I'm thinking of traditional investors getting really involved in this dialogue. Companies respond to those two groups, I'd say primarily. Whether that's good or bad, I think it can lead to a lot of good. But how do we make sure that government is pushing companies to invest in women in a meaningful way? And it can happen. I think we're not there yet, but perhaps that can be part of the solutions to figure out how do you bring those two groups around the table, because you'll get companies to react in a really meaningful way, not just a checkbox, but a meaningful way.
Thank you. I want to hear from some other folks in the audience. I know there's some thoughtful people here. Ambassador Dugan, thanks for being here.
First of all, congratulations to you all. I think this is a very succinct report from my glancing at it. There's so many things that you've touched on that it always says, okay, but what about this? What about the role of men? What about other things? But something I'm particularly involved in, among other things, a company actually now. It started out as an NGO in Mexico called Blue Box, and it has it's an incubator, accelerator, and fundraiser for entrepreneurs who don't even know how to be an entrepreneur. And they started out as a nonprofit, and then they decided, if we're going to teach these people to make money, we better become a for-profit. So now they are the largest incubator network in Latin America. In 2 years. They're already making money, and 80% of the staff and senior management are all women. And it was never intended that way. So I just tossed this out as yet another example, and we have so many. But I am a little concerned because of experiences in a number of lives that when you get too much of a government edict, you get an invitation to corruption. And so I think that's something that we cannot walk away from. And so that even though private-public partnerships are wonderful ideas and sometimes work, I would put in the admonishment to look at things that if the government's involved, then it should be moving out of it, because it becomes too much box checking and all the kinds of things that you've had to deal with. So I, again, applaud you all and look forward to learning more about what you're doing.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, Wade.
Hi, Wade Channel from USAID. I just want to throw out to you what we had a little bit of a conversation at lunch. Sorry for those who were not at lunch, but I hope you ate well.
It was really good.
It was an
excellent.
amazing lunch, really,
Right.
and good cooking too. Thank
Right,
you, Dan. We run into each other at the grocery store all the time these days. so
Exactly.
I know where
He and I are running into exactly in McLean, in the McLean Giant. Let's stop meeting like this.
You know, you've mentioned the issues like the wage gap, et cetera. We have all of these norm problems, but one of the ones that is across the board affecting women in the world is violence against women. And I'm not going to use, with instruction from one of the folks at USAID, he said, I want everyone to stop using acronyms. GBV sounds like, something you get rid of with a shot. Violence is not. So I want to use the word violence. There's a lot of violence against women, and a lot of it is physical, sexual, there's financial, there's emotional, et cetera. And we don't normally think of that as a business issue, unless, okay, within a business, you're not allowed to do these things with your employees. Can you see this as a business issue, and do you see ways that we could come together to address this?
Okay, so I want to talk about the question for this group about violence. And I'm thinking of the factory work, for example. That I suspect that came across your radar screen in that context. But also, I think Ambassador Dugan's point about government and how much of this needs to be kind of aspirational or sort of challenge, and how much of this needs to be, you better do this or else, if I can put it that way. How much of this should this be aspirational? How much of this is something that needs to have some kind of a force of legal compliance? I think that's a little bit to what you were getting at, Ambassador Dugan. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So either one of those or both. Let me start with you, Yes, please. Yeah, sorry.
So
All right,
just
sorry.
to start backwards, so on violence, just giving you an example, so how much it impacts obviously business and how much it is a business issue. So the World Bank had halted a loan in Uganda for 90 million, a transport project, because what happened is, and what happens in most cases when you have large influx of labor, you have very disproportionate power abuses at play, and so it led to impregnating 6 girls underage. And an NGO from Uganda brought forward a case to the ombudsman, and it was addressed at that level, but then the president had put together an external advisory group on gender-based violence or violence against women to see what can we do across all of our projects. So taking that one instance, knowing fully well it will not be the only instance, but it is the only instance that has halted the project and where we have learned about what happened, thanks to the NGO. And the NGO is actually now on the External Advisory Council, so we've taken that very serious. And that has led us now, the task force is putting together a set of recommendations as to how can we embed much more vigorous screening against high-risk potential, both on the public as well as the private sector side. And so IFC has started to take its own journey in that sphere, in the sense that we look particularly hard at sectors that are more prone to incidents of violence against women, clearly more female-dominated sectors, so garment sector, flower sector, and so on, and then highly male-dominated sectors. And education for various reasons as well, of course, because you have abuse between teachers and students and sugar daddies and all kinds of challenges that pertain with just going and arriving safely at school. So I'm really glad you made that point, because it's also something we've worked actually together with George Washington and others in DC. And we have a brilliant violence against women's guide for each sector. So if you work in energy, what you need to look at, what are the other topics. Now, just spinning very quickly onto the government part. So what we've seen is the more transparent government services are around procurement, around all kinds of other issues in terms of licensing and so on, of course, the better for both men and women. But disproportionately so for women, in particular because women have a lack of mobility to move around as freely as men are. And so the more you digitize transparent rules as to who is a woman-owned supplier, what do you need to do, where can you get licensed and so on, the better disproportionately so for women. And I'm generalizing, and I think we all have generalized, and I think not to forget that, of course, low-income women have very different needs and wants from women who have got more assets to their agenda. And that's the last point that I would want to make, is I think the one thing that we haven't yet done a good job on collectively is to understanding the shared economy. And yes, I think a lot of people perceive it to be very US-centric, but yet if you look at how many cities Uber operates in, and I jumped into an Uber, right? I jumped into an Uber in Kenya, I used it in Nairobi, I used it in South Africa. What do these shared economy models do to who, for what reason, and are they expanding economic opportunity and mobility, or they're limiting it? And of course, it's not black and white. There's very multidimensional answers to that, but we have very little understanding of data points, and I think that's something I think we need to think a little bit harder about. What does it mean in terms of assets, and where does government need to regulate, and where do we need to get the market to be able to explore more?
Okay, so either of those two topics I'd welcome.
Yeah, I think that if we do start to enter a compliance discussion or model, we're in trouble. And I think about education reform, and when I was reading through the report and kind of thinking about the big issue of women's empowerment, I think we are at a tipping point, and that we could go down that path of education reform when you have the best intentions. There are all of these, regulations and laws in place, but nothing really happens. And you think about underserved communities. There's money poured into it, there are programs put in place, but you never get at the systemic issues of why education is not equal and there's not access for all. And so I think that's a compliance model, and that we have the opportunity and should stay away from that. It's just figuring out where can you help create frameworks and aligned visions. I do think also that companies should stick to your business strategy. What are you good at? What are the issues that are affecting your business from growing? Because that growth is then going to fuel the economy and opportunities for women. So that's where we stand.
I would just add we come at it much the same way. So for us, when it comes to setting priorities on social or environmental issues, we start with what is our core business and what do our what are stakeholders concerned about? What are the social and environmental issues where they would say we have something relevant to bring to those issues by virtue of our capabilities? So we've been talking a lot about empowering women in supply chains. Other examples would be emissions reduction. We're doing quite a bit around climate change and so on. So when it comes to violence against women specifically, I'd say that we're probably just touching it on the periphery, connected to some things that are more central, for us. So a couple examples would be just the work that we're trying to do through women's economic empowerment in factories, for example. Some of the modules focus very much on giving women voice so they can recognize situations they're in and deal with those. But I'd say that's tangentially getting at what you're talking about. We also have a number of initiatives underway around forced labor in supply chains. So we've joined the Leadership for Responsible Recruitment, and we've prioritized eradicating forced labor. Our focus right now is in seafood and apparel. We're looking at other chains as well. So, again, to the extent that manifests there. But I would say that has not been a central issue of our focus in our work to date.
Great. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and I know if I end things on time, people will come back to my events at CSIS. So I want to ask you all to please join me in thanking the panel.